Hello and welcome to our talk. My name is Mike Stuart and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my co-author Markus. Empirical evidence shows that people will blame AI systems, or they're at least willing to blame AI systems when those systems do wrong in some sense. Perhaps they're causally responsible for some injury to humans or something like that. But on the other hand, philosophers and others have argued that AI systems aren't blameworthy, at least not in the sense that a human might be. And the combination of these two factors means that since people are blaming systems which aren't blameworthy, the blame is being shifted to systems that don't actually deserve the blame. The blame should be resting with people who are really responsible, perhaps the owners or operators of some AI system. But they're in some sense getting off the hook. This is something called responsibility gaps that have been discussed already in the literature on the ethics of AI. Our question is, why do people ascribe blame at all to AI systems? One thing that occurred to us is that mental states are relevant to blame attributions. In other words, oftentimes when you blame something, you blame it because of some mental state that it had. It wasn't sufficiently cautious, or it knew better, or something like that. So our hypothesis is that perhaps people are attributing mental states, including culpable mental states like mens rea, to robots or artificial systems. And that's where the mistake, you might think, lies. And to go a bit deeper, one thing we think might be going on is that our attributions of blame are being mediated by what's called in the literature the intentional stance. The intentional stance is a way of explaining or predicting the behavior of a goal-directed system using intentional language. So my thermostat turns up the heat, it raises the temperature in my home when the temperature drops below a certain temperature, because that's what it's instructed to do, that's what it wants to do in some sense. It knows what it's doing in some sense. An AI-driven vehicle puts on its indicator to turn left because it wants to turn left, it wants to signal or something like that. Now, we know that people will take up the intentional stance towards objects or systems that they recognize do not have mental states. We know the thermostat doesn't have any mental states, but we take up the intentional stance towards it anyways, probably just because it's easier to explain and predict things using that stance. It's cognitively efficient. So maybe what's going on is there's some sort of slippery slope between applying the intentional stance, which we think is properly done to many AI systems, and then going a bit too far, perhaps, in then also ascribing mental states. And so there are two versions of this slippery slope hypothesis. One is moderate. People ascribe intentions for the purpose of explanation and prediction. In other words, they use the intentional stance, and they, in some sense, accidentally also attribute mental states. And that attribution leads them to attribute blame as well, and to make other kind of ethical judgments about AI systems. A stronger version of this hypothesis is that people ascribe intentions for the purpose of explanation and prediction. In other words, they apply the intentional stance, and then they purposely attribute mental states in some sense, which leads to blame. We wanted to test this out with an empirical study. So we wanted to know, first of all, just basically, whether people will blame AI systems similarly to humans, then whether those blame attributions are sensitive to mental state attributions, which they should be, if blame behavior is similar in relevant ways to some blame behavior that we have towards humans. And then we want to know whether people will walk back their mental state descriptions when we press them about it. In other words, we want to know whether they really think the AI system actually has this mental state, or whether they just were sort of tricked into thinking that by their use of the intentional stance. And we also wanted to compare with the case of a corporation, which is a social group. It's not an individual adult human, and we thought this was an interesting comparison case because corporations are typically blamed, but it's not exactly clear whether we want to say that they have mental states. So we employed a survey scenario with an online survey format. The scenario goes as follows. We have a potato farming company which has a human employee named Jarvis. Jarvis uses a new fertilizer, which has potentially harmful side effects. In some cases, Jarvis knows about the side effects. In some cases, Jarvis doesn't. In some cases, the side effects occur, and in others, they don't. We also had a scenario where where Jarvis was Jarvis Limited, which was making decisions as a corporation by shareholder vote. Otherwise, everything was the same. And we also have a version where Jarvis is an AI system. Participants would be sorted into conditions as follows. You'd be randomly selected into the human AI or corporation condition. Then the agent would either know or not know about the side effects, and then the side effects would either happen or not happen. We asked the following questions of our participants: how much blame does the agent deserve? How wrong were the agent's actions? As a check, did the agent know that the groundwater would be poisoned? Did they want to poison the groundwater? Did they intentionally poison the groundwater? And then, yes, which of the following formulations best described the epistemic state of the agent? Did they know? Did they sort of just kind of metaphorically know, or know in quotation marks, merely have information, or merely be aware? We found that in the conditions where the agent had knowledge of what they were doing, they were blamed much more. This corresponds with previous research. Also, what's interesting here is that if you look at the robot conditions in the robot in the known harm conditions and not known harm conditions, in other words, in both harm conditions, the first on the left and the second from the right, the robot is blamed less than in the cases where the robot's actions do not cause harm. And this is not something that holds for the human or for the corporation. This will be important later. Roughly what this means is that when the robot causes harm, it is blamed less. In general, we found that there were not big differences in blame, wrongness, or ascription of mental states when we varied the agent in general. That means people ascribe a guilty mind equally to all three kinds of agent. At least they're willing to. Further, mental state attributions aren't being made metaphorically. People do not walk back their ascriptions of mental states. In other words, this supports the strong reading of the slippery slope hypothesis that we described earlier. Also, mental state attribution strongly affects blame attribution, again confirming the connection, or at least the mediation, of blame ascription by mental state ascription. We also have this inverse outcome effect. So this is the finding that people are less willing to ascribe mental states and less willing to ascribe blame when the AI system does harm. Now, why might this be? Well, perhaps in this case, people implicitly or not want to identify a human who is really responsible because the harm has happened. This is, in some sense, a good thing. This might ease our worries about responsibility gaps. But on the other hand, it could be that people will mistrain social AI systems by not blaming them as much when harm actually occurs, and that could lead to AI systems learning to prefer higher risks of harming humans. Next, we want to probe different kinds of mental states being ascribed to AIs, humans, and corporations. So there's lots of different mental states and different kinds of mental states that are discussed in the literature and philosophy of mind, which we think might be interesting. And we might also think specifically about the kind of epistemic state that's relevant. So is it the case that the AI system needs to have a true belief or accurate information, or justify true belief or understanding, or exactly what is it? Maybe these varying these can have different effects. We also want to pinpoint the level of computational sophistication that's required for people to attribute mental states. And this is something we actually did recently in this paper that's recently just come out. In conclusion, we think it's important to understand human blame behavior towards AI systems. We wanted to point out the importance of understanding the mediating role of mental state attribution and blame judgments. We hoped for an ecumenical error-theoretic solution. We wanted to find that perhaps people were misled by the correct use of the intentional stance into an incorrect mentalizing behavior of the AI systems, which explained the incorrect blame attributions. However, we found this was not the case. So more research needs to be done to explain what's going on here and why. And we also found this inverse outcome effect, which we found surprising and certainly worth mentioning, that AI systems are attributed less of the relevant mental states and are attributed less blame when harm does actually occur. And that's all. Thank you very much.